We have 5 children. Matthew, who's 13, Sarah, 11, Sophie, who is 8, Rachel, 5, and Andrew's 14 months.
I like the fact that we have so many siblings so that we can mix around a lot.
I like my siblings and I have a lot of fun with them.
My father, we share quite a lot of interests together, like Gundams and cars, and electronic IT stuff.
Sarah.
Sarah, she's a very social kind of person who likes to be with her friends.
She would help other people as best as she can and help me look after the younger ones also.
Sophie's the most enthusiastic
energetic
and energetic person in the family.
in the whole world.
Rachel's very cute, although she's
Not naughty.
Our whole family and life really changed a lot when we had Rachel.
Yeah.
I don't feel that we need to be overly sad or pessimistic about Rachel's situation because her life is good. Objectively, her life is good. She's a blessing to all of us and everyone who knows her, just as the other kids also are.
And there's Andrew.
He's a cheerful baby.
He's very, very cheerful.
Yeah.
He seldom cries. He only cries when he's desperate for milk after his shower.
And you're too slow to put the bottle down.
Milk! The marriage is the core of the family.
Yes, a marriage is the heart of the family.
There's a saying that husbands, the best thing you can do for your children is to love your wife.
Your wife, yeah. Put the marriage first before the children.
If two people, husband and wife, establish themselves and put their priority with each other as good spouses, what's going to naturally follow is that they will be good parents because they will see eye to eye. They will have a unified view on important matters like finance, how to raise children, discipline, things like that. It actually makes parenting easier, having that level of
And the
priority.
kids need to see that. They have to see that we come first to each other. How do we make our marriage work?
I think the single most important thing is our date nights.
We spend time together.
I mean-
good quality time.
Yes, it's not
Not
just
being fetched here and there in the car.
I think that the date nights which we try to do every week really helps us as a couple to understand each other and understand each other's thoughts. I think just like it's very important for us to spend time with each other as a couple, it's also important to spend time alone with each child. It can be something that's planned, or it can be something that is as short as 5 minutes together in the morning that you just take the opportunity to make the most use of it. It could be something as simple as going to the supermarket.
With each child, there are all these little moments, and this is what I really find a big joy for us. It's always the nicest when somebody comes to me and it's very intimate, just the two of us. It doesn't have to be very deep, they just share something from their lives, their experience, something they saw, something that they're thinking, maybe for the older ones, something that they're concerned about. And I feel that I can help them so much and I can have an impact on their lives.
People at their deathbeds, they don't regret not making enough money, but they do regret not spending enough time with their family. To which I would say, if you know this from the start, just do it. You might have to make some sacrifices to do it, but don't give in to external pressure to have to chase after things that everyone else is chasing. If you know that this is important for you, do it, and you won't regret it.
It just makes your life so full and so rich. This is like the journey of a lifetime, actually. You can't imagine what's going to happen next. It's more fun than roller coaster riding. Definitely.
More ups and downs
Everyone has to discover
for yourself.
that magic for themselves. So it's a gift, really. It is a gift. So if you have a chance to experience and receive this gift, then don't say no.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for joining us again on Dad's Matter. So, I never get tired of watching that video. But as you know, we're ending the first season of Dad's Matter tonight. So this is our fifth and last session with Mike before we take a break and then come back again for season 2. And of course, we're going to do it by tackling the juvenile tornado, the teenage twister, as we call it, those stormy years of parenting that leave your hair feeling just a little bit thinner. So Mr. Mike Hall, the founder of Strong Fathers, Strong Families, is going to be talking about many of the challenges dads face raising teenagers, including tantrums, defiance, cyber addiction, stress, anxiety. It's going to be an exciting episode of Dad's Matter. And as always, we want to encourage you to ask as many questions as you can, which you can leave in the chat box. So how are we going to get our teens ready to face the world in a successful, well-invested adults without giving ourselves an ulcer, or worse, giving them one as well? Mike, I know you have plenty to share with us tonight, so I don't want to hold you up. Let's jump right into it, all right?
All right. So, so glad you guys could join us. Yeah, so this is a question that comes up quite a bit. When we talked earlier in another session, we talked about development and typically of, 0, 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-olds. And we talked about some of that development. And when we talk about that development, it always comes up. It's like, this is great. What about teenagers? For some of you that have been on our coaching sessions over the last 2 Wednesdays, this is a topic that's come up both times. And we've had lots of discussion about it because there's the issue when we talked about discipline of how do you handle discipline as a dad where you're doing the things that get your kids to make better choices, better changes, and at the same time, you're not coming across as too harsh, that can be damaging. And so we've had those conversations at our coaching sessions. We had those in one of our other sessions. And talking about the role of dads and moms and how they're different. And it all comes down to also, but what about these challenges of teenagers? And we're so concerned about teenagers because of some of the things we'll talk about today. But I remember growing up, my dad was a high school football coach. So I was around teenagers from a very young age. Like when I was 3 and 4 years old, I was on the school bus with my father going to football games and track meets. And so it was like I was in high school for 15 years. But I remember also going to church. And at that time, all they talked about in church was how evil teenagers were and how teenagers are going to do all these bad things. And I will tell you that when I turned 13, because I was, I say a Pharisee, for those of you that know what that means, but very concerned about my faith, very concerned about my soul. And when I turned 13, I just knew I was going to start drinking and smoking and carousing because that's all I'd ever been warned about. Now, my dad didn't treat teenagers like that, but the message I got from the culture, society, and I was late 60s, early 70s as a kid. That's how old I am. But, it was like, oh, these kids. And I was scared to death to be a teenager because everything that was being said about a teenager. And one thing I realized from my own father was the reason that I survived my own teenage years is because my dad had worked with enough teenagers that when I became a teenager, he did not, in fact, kill me. Right? We live on the family farm. He could have done away with me, told everybody I ran away. Nobody had ever found me. But luckily, he had worked with teenagers enough to know that, yes, his son as a teenager was crazy, but they all kind of are. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that and how to navigate that. And some things you can do now before your child's a teenager, some things to do while your child's a teenager, and maybe some things to do for yourself after they're teenagers. And so we're going to kind of hit that. This is something that, scares you to death. This young lady actually did a YouTube just with all these piercings. It's not how she typically walks around, but it's a picture that scares us to death. And when people ask about teenagers, I've actually had this question asked more than once. Like, how do you know when your child really becomes a teenager that you're supposed to be concerned about? Like, people know that when a child turns 13, things aren't automatic. They don't automatically start smoking and drinking, doing all these, being defiant. But kind of how do you know? And I said, well, you'll know when your child has become a full-fledged teenager when they can't form complete sentences, when they bump into everything and their whole room smells like feet. And those of us that raise boys know that, but I've also heard from dads of daughters that said, look, boys don't have anything on girls on messy rooms and stinky clothes and just general stinkiness. And the idea too is, well, okay, so kids are entering puberty. And so that's the reason teenagers are so insane and doing these things. And those things play a role, right? We cannot not act like kids have hormonal issues, which a lot of times drives their sexuality and the things that they're dealing with and their body growing and just freaking out about what's going on in their body. Parents freaking out about all of a sudden I've got a child with a mustache. That could be a son or a daughter. That would freak you out either way. But you're worried about these things, and hormones definitely play a role. But one of the things we have to realize is that one of the things that goes on with teenagers that we don't always talk about is the fact that when you're raising your children, the real deal is they're beginning to see you differently. You see them differently because of the growth, because of the hormones, because of the changes they're making mentally, socially, physically. But one of the bigger issues when you get down to the real heart of it is when your children are smaller, and this is for dads, it's also for moms, but we, in the lives of most of our children, kind of have this superhero, superhuman persona. Dad knows everything. Dad can open the jars. Dad can fix stuff. Even for those of us that can't fix a whole lot, you can fix more than an 8-year-old, so they think you're pretty awesome. And so all these times that we're doing things that kids are like, that's amazing. My dad knows everything. My mom knows everything. And then all of a sudden, they kind of figure out, both from their own personal experience and honestly life with you, where they're starting to pay a little bit more attention to what is life like out there. They began to figure out that, oh, wait, even if I think my dad's a superhero, he's got some challenges. He's got some chinks in his armor. He's got some problems with, his superhero-ness. He's got some kryptonite in his life. And so all of a sudden, what my dad told me, where I thought he was so smart, then I found out something as a teenager, that my dad didn't know something. I know something my dad doesn't know. Or I didn't think my dad knew. Or my dad didn't care to know it, and I think it's very important because I'm now 12, 13, 14. And all of a sudden, my dad's not as smart as I thought he was. And so it's kind of deflating to them. And it becomes deflating to parents because we begin to see their attitude change, right? And so two things happen. Number one, they begin to see us as the fallible humans we are. And it's really unsettling for our kids. It's also unsettling for us as parents to kind of lose our status of being all-knowing, all-seeing, and kind of being the superhero. And all of a sudden, we're not being treated like the superhero. As well, we talked about development. And we talked about how kids develop. And we all know, and we've talked about the terrible twos. And so I want to kind of run this video. There's no sound with it, but some of you have seen this. Is a very viral video. And this young man's about 2.5 years old, knocks in the putt. He's done great. Look at the confidence. And we have the same thing with our teenagers, right? We're like, man, they're really articulate. They're doing really great things in education. I'm able to have different conversations with this child. They're really, hitting the hole in one, and then they miss. And this is what happens to 2-year-olds, but it's also what happens to teenagers. And it also happens to adult men on the golf course, by the way. So this is probably a learned behavior on Peter's part here, probably watching his dad. But we talk about the terrible twos, and then we also talk about the terrible teens. I have so many people concerned about their children before they become teenagers because they've heard how bad it is. They've heard how hard it was. They remember, and one of the big issues is we remember how hard it was with us as a teenager. And one of your challenges, let's just talk about this for a minute. One of your challenges as a parent of teenagers is you remember how marginalized or difficult you thought it was as a teenager yourself. And you don't want your child to go through that. So you're thinking, how can I parent better than my parents did? What you'll find is your parents might have done a pretty good job, And being a teenager is just hard. Being a parent of a teenager is just hard. Because of this time of development, we have to understand how hard it is, right? So what we think of as development is we think our children just, let me see if I can do this. There we go. Just grow, right? We're like our kids, and particularly they're like, well, they're just supposed to grow, and they just develop and they develop and they develop. And yet that's not how it feels. One of the challenges we have with teenagers is when we've been through this development phase, we've seen some of the disturbances, and now, like I said, they're more educated, they're more articulate, they're making different decisions, they've grown, they can carry on a different kind of conversation, and particularly before they become this, kind of a lump of a teenager, all of a sudden we're like, boy, this child has really come into its own, and they have. But then we as parents sometimes expect it not to go, oh, I'm going the wrong direction again, right? Going this way, all of a sudden we start setting our expectations that this kid has met some kind of apex. And so now it's just everything is up from here. And that's not always the case. Number one, it's not fair to kids, but it's not how kids truly develop. And one of the challenges we have as parents is our kids hit a certain place and we're like, all right, now we're there, we've arrived, and this kid's going to do great. And it's usually about the time they're 12. I tell people, we kind of like our kids between 10 and 12. They become more playful. Like I said, conversations change. They become more responsible in some ways. They're able to do some more things. And so we're like, boy, this is great. And then they turn 13, 14, or 15, and then things happen. And so whereas the development is not like this, and we don't want it to be like this, just like Thomas mentioned earlier, this is what real development really kind of looks like. So they grow and there's a disturbance, and then they grow and there's a disturbance. And so throughout the teen years, you're going to have this really great moment and you're like, wow, they're doing really well. Maybe we're through it. You're not, because after every growth, there's this new tornado, because they grow and then they've got to decide, okay, what do I do with this new growth? And that's physical, that's emotional, that's cognitive. A child they begin to realize that they're gaining insight that they didn't have before. They're beginning to realize that they're being asked academically to do things that as a younger child, they didn't think they were capable of. And they are becoming competent, hopefully, in their education. And so now they have this growth. But then there's like, but I don't like the expectations that are put on me. It was easy and now it's not. It goes back to that tantrum we just saw, that I hit a hole in one. And so, man, I'm golden. I'm a great golfer or whatever. I'm a great student. I'm really good at math. I'm really good at singing. This was something I went through with my kids. Both my kids were pretty musically inclined, and they were good musicians and actually could sing pretty well as younger kids. And then their voice, and so they would sing in public. They would lead singing in our church. And then all of a sudden their voice started to change. And we really had to work to motivate them to work through it, because they're like, now I'm no good at anything. No, it's not the case. Your voice is changing and it's different, but you still have that skill set. And so that's where you find the tornadoes. I'm very popular. I have friends, and at 10 and 11 and 12, everybody's your friends. And then all of a sudden, things change. There's actually a great book out. I'll actually put the link up in a little bit, called, it's speaking about American middle schools, but I think it's very standard, particularly in, where we have higher levels of education. The book is called And Then They Stopped Talking to Me. And that's very much a marker of teenagers of, I had all my friends, we went to all these parties, we always got together, I started having sleepovers, I started having friends around me, and now all of a sudden my friends are changing and they're selecting up, they're making different life choices, and so all of that's another tornado, right? My parents were great, and now my parents are idiots, another tornado. Or I got to do these things, and now that I'm older, I should be able to do more things because look how competent and capable I am, but now my parents don't see it. So another tornado. And so through this development, it's physical, it's emotional. Like I said, it's cognitive, that I'm growing, I'm doing well. And then all of a sudden there's this storm. Same thing for parents. We're either dealing with their storm or we're dealing with our own, and our kids are having to deal with that storm. So let's talk about kind of the things we can do. So what are we to do as dads, or what are we to do as parents? And that's a real challenge, but there's a few things that I want us to kind of lay out, and then throw your questions in the chat, because this will lend itself to that discussion. So last time we met, we talked about mom being the center of the universe, dad coming in from the outside and being the one that sets parameters, right? And so we are always on the outside. We're always between our child and the rest of the real world. And so part of our job is to be the one that sets boundaries. Well, guess what? That's our job. Like it says, you are here. And so what does that look like? What does that mean to be the one that sets boundaries? And this is where, when we talk about the challenge of a single parent, if it's a single mom, well, single moms can do it all. Single moms can be great, but they can't be in both places at the same time. They're either the center of the universe or they're the one setting parameters, but you can't be both. Single fathers can be the one setting parameters, but they can't be the one that nurtures and kisses the boo-boos when the kids run back to them, because they can't be there if they're the one setting parameters. So our job, typically, both in the heart of a father and really the heart of our kids, and really in the heart of our wives and the mothers of our children, are, to make sure that this child does not go too far. And part of our job as the dad is sometimes to bring them out, drag them out a little bit further, because mom's being protective. And we talked in our last session about that constant negotiation. But as a father, your job is to be the boundary. Guess what teenagers want to do? They want to bust every boundary you have. And I don't think it makes it harder on dads, but I think it's a huge job that dads have in the lives of teenagers. So when we talk about being intentional as a father, and we talk about being present, your biggest job is to be the boundary. And so what does that mean? What does that look like when we're trying to be the boundary for a kid that's just pushing and pushing and pushing? And they're pushing the boundary because that's what they do. They're pushing the boundary because that's what we raise them to do. We want them to grow. We want them to ask questions, even though it can be quite painful and really just quite the hassle. And so 4 things we want to talk about on being the boundary. You want to set the boundary. You want to define the limits. You want to instruct to the inside of those boundaries. And then don't move the lines. In other words, once you become the boundary, hold fast. I almost pulled up the video from Braveheart where, they're being stormed by the English, and he's just hold, and that was in my heart as the father of teenagers. My wife would tell me that, or I would tell me that. But that doesn't mean the line doesn't expand, but the boundary is always there. And so we'll discuss that as well. So setting the boundaries and defining limits is a little bit different. And so we want to talk about that, because it sounds the same. And I even wrestled with, how do we discuss this? So I was telling the group before you guys came in the room that we've had a ton of rain here in Texas. My wife and I just bought a piece of property next to us as a wedding venue. So it's a lot of open field grass, and the rains came. We had 6 inches of rain, and grass is going nuts. So I'm mowing and mowing and mowing. Well, when I was a child, let's go back. When I was a child, my dad would let me mow with our push mower. We didn't have a riding lawnmower. We weren't those rich people. But I had a push mower. But what my dad would do would be mow around the boundary, like mow around the curbs, mow close to the house or the sidewalk, mow by the flower beds, and then would tell me, okay, now mow everything within this. And so as my kids got older, when my youngest son got to where we were rich, right? We had a riding lawnmower. Actually, I just sacrificed to make sure I could get a riding lawnmower because I wasn't going to push anymore. But he had a riding lawnmower. He was 9 or 10, really excited to do the mowing. And so one day I said, okay, here's what you do. Here's how you put it in gear. Here's how you turn it off. Always disengage the blade before you get off the mower, trying to be as safe as possible. And I said, but let me do this. And so in our own yard, I went around by our fence. I went around by our house. I put in all the boundaries where it would be more difficult for him as a novice to mow. And that same day, my dad, who had a commercial hay business, called me and said, can you come help me for a minute? And I said, yeah, what do you need? He said, well, we're trying to do this, and this at the same time, and I need an extra set of hands, extra hand, if you will. And so I went and met him at the field. He put me on the tractor and said, here's how we run this grass cutter. It's a huge hay cutter, probably 12, 15 foot long, and cuts lots of grass very quickly, right, on a really large cab-over tractor. And so I rode around with him, and he showed me, number one, how to run the controls, and he set the outside boundary. He ran that cutter next to the fences and around some barriers because he knew I was new at it. And I was probably 20 or 30 minutes into that process when I went, wait, I just had that done to me. My dad just set the boundaries on me as an adult man. And two things. Number one, I needed it because I was still learning. Number two, I realized that's what dads do, right? And so part of us setting the boundary is giving kids a safe space within which to work. Why? Because they're not competent out to the outer edge. They're not competent in certain ways to where they know how to handle as they get closer to things that they're not ready for. And so when you're setting the boundary, you can still give them a large area in which to work. Like I told my kids, I said, once I mow the boundary, I'm like, you can go left to right. You can go north, south, east, west. You can go however you want inside these boundaries. So as long as you're mowing the grass, knock yourself out now that you're within the boundaries. And the same thing goes for our kids, is once you set the boundary and you're protecting them, you give them what we would call that hedge of giving them that boundary of, okay, don't get past this. Because we really feel like you're competent enough to handle this large of an area, but not on these outer edges. These outer edges are places you don't need to be yet. Okay, and so by setting the boundary, you're not just saying don't go there, but you're giving them, think of boundaries as not just the no, but the yes that's all in the middle. And so going back to my farm life, all of a sudden we're doing like, this is your life. Defining the limits. See, setting the boundary is giving them an area within which to live and work. That's different than defining the limits. Defining the limits is when you have mowed that boundary around, saying, look, don't go past that. So when I was in high school, one of the ways that I raised money to go to college was I raised pigs. We have the farm here. There was a great market for them at the time. It was a big kind of, not a big deal in our area. That sounds like, boy, that metropolitan, isn't it? You should raise hogs. But raising pigs was actually an easier venture agriculturally. It was lucrative for a high school kid, if you will. And so I ran anywhere from 20 to 30 to 40 pigs at a time, which was nothing compared to these large farms, but for a high school kid was a pretty big deal. Well, the way we contained these pigs was we would put up electric fence. And it's no fun to hit an electric fence. It doesn't kill you, but it will remind you that there's an electric fence there, and it will remind you of what electricity feels like. I promise you, because I've hit it more than one time. And we had certain pigs, they would come up and they would be curious, and they would either try to go under the wire or they would just sniff at the wire and it would zap them. And they're like, man, that is absolutely no fun. I don't want to ever do that again. And then you'd have other pigs that would come up and they'd hit that and they're like, oh, that's no fun, but I still want what's on the other side. And so they'd go at it again and it would hit them and they're like, that's no fun. And so we had some pigs that if you turned the fence off, they stayed there the whole time. Because as soon as they got close to that wire, even if they weren't shocked by it, they're like, man, I don't want anything to do with that limit. I don't want anything to do with what that does to me when I go past my limit. And then we had other pigs that we didn't keep around for long because they would want to get out of the boundaries, get out of that limiting thing, and they would run for the fence, and they would actually begin to squeal before they hit the fence because they knew it was going to hurt, but they were going anyways. And if you want to know what taught me about teenagers when I was a teenager, that was a huge lesson for me when I became a middle school principal and even a father of my own two children, of sometimes they don't like that limit. And then sometimes it doesn't matter what the limit feels like, they're going to bust through it. And so part of what you can do is not just by setting that boundary, but by defining the limits, there is a consequence when you go past that boundary. It could be a natural consequence. It could be one that you've placed on them, but there is a limit to how much this boundary goes. And so when we talk about fences, when we talk about boundaries, I brought this picture up because this is kind of typical of teenagers, but it's also typical of us. It's typical of us as humans. As soon as you give us a limit, we just want to know what's on the other side of the limit. And what we begin to do with teenagers is we begin to say no a lot, right? The terrible twos are kids learning the power of their own no, like that they can make decisions against their parents. And that's what's really terrible about the terrible twos. Part of what is terrible about the teens is that somebody is telling them no. They've gained this competence, they've gained this view of the world, but now we've still set a limit on them. And we've set a limit for a really good reason, and we've set a limit for their own good, but all they're hearing is no. And one of the reasons all they're hearing is no is because they just keep asking to expand the limits. But think about this. So when you define the boundary and say you can stay within this, that's a really positive thing to do. When you define the limits, you say, but if you try to get past what we've given you, what we've allowed you to do, there's going to be some consequences. And there's some consequences out there we're trying to prevent for you that don't even come from us. You know, if you act like a jerk, then you're not going to have friends, and we want you to have friends. If you act like a jerk, you're going to make our family look bad, and we don't want our family to look bad. If you act like a jerk, if you act defiant, if you act disrespectful, you're not going to get the education we want you to have, and you're not going to be regarded as you should be with our last name. I think that's important for kids to know. And so when we define the limits, we've spent a lot of time doing that. But by defining the limits, all we ever do is talk about the limits, and all the kids ask is, what about this? What about this? Why can't I? And we always say, no, 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 because there's a reason there's a limit there. What we're not doing as much, and what I think makes it better for us as parents and our kids, is we're not instructing to the inside. Like these dogs right here have this huge yard to run, play, relax. It's the same thing that drives you crazy as a parent, because you realize everything you've given to your child. Look at all the things that I've done for you. Look at all the things that we have for you, and you're not happy. Because what they're not happy with is the limit. They can't see all the things that they have because they want something else. That's human nature. It's magnified times 100 for teenagers. And we and teenagers are just like these dogs. I got this whole yard to play in, and all I want to know is what's out there. And so what we don't spend time doing that I think helps us spend time doing is helps our kids to realize that, wait, there's a lot going on inside that we could talk about. And so let's talk about what's on the inside. What does that mean? Because when you're defining limits, all you're doing is saying no, 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 and you may be given reasons to the no, but all they're hearing is no. And all we're spending our time on is the negative. And so when we talk about instructing to the inside, what is inside? Respect, values, responsibility, and compassion. And so what does that mean? Well, the reason we set limits is because it goes past some of these things. Well, why can't I go do whatever I want in school? Because there are rules in school, because there's more than you in school. You're not the only person in the universe. And that's a big issue for teenagers. They don't understand that they and their two friends are not the most important people on the planet, because it feels like that to them. But what we're teaching too on the inside is that, the reason there's a limit here is because you've got to have a level of respect. A level of respect for the rules, a level of respect for other family members, a level of respect for those in authority, a level of respect for just those around you. Right now in this COVID time, it's very hard because everybody wants what they want. And yet part of our respect is to understand that some people are compromised. And no matter what thing I want to do, if I do it, number one, there's a consequence for me. But even if I'm not worried about consequences for me, my own behavior can impact somebody else very drastically. And that's a hard, and you're seeing adults not handle that well. But that's what kids don't always understand. They don't always see the larger world around them. They don't see down the line that we do as parents. We know what they're headed for. And so respect becomes a very big issue. What are our values? Why do we not go do these things? Why can't I go do, why can't I say, why can't I think this way? Why can't I tell mom that I figured out is she's not the smartest person now? Why can't I say things to my mom because I think sometimes she's dumb when she's not? But here's the thing. Number one, you don't know what we know and don't know as parents. Number two, even if you're the smartest kid on the planet, you will not talk to your mother that way. That's not what we value here in our family. You will not treat others this way. That's not what our values are here. And so when we're talking about the inside, instead of always saying no, 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 you can say the yes, and the yes to these things and the why to these things. Here's what our values are. Here's what your responsibility is. I need you to take out the trash. Oh my goodness. The battles that we've all fought with teenagers over taking out the garbage, right? Or doing their chores, whatever their chores may be. And believe me, as we talk about season 2, we could do a whole 5 sessions on chores, because your children need to have responsibilities to take care of things around the house. Even if you have help, even if you're the person that does it, even if you're way better at washing dishes, no matter what the situation is, for our kids to grow and be responsible, they need to have responsibility from a young age. So there's my soapbox and my precursor for what may be coming. But we've got to teach them responsibility. You want to go do all these things, but you have a responsibility to the family. And that responsibility comes before all the things you want to do selfishly. And selfishly may not be bad, but selfishly is outside of the responsibilities you have. And then the same thing is on compassion. Teenagers are very compassionate when someone else is not, right? Like when you as a parent say something, not even negative or nasty, but you say something that they don't agree with about somebody else, usually within the sanctity of your own home, man, your children will lose their minds. You know, and we've got some very young activists in our country right now, and I think their heart is in the right place. I think their knowledge could be in the right place. But what sometimes kids don't understand is the complexity of the situation. And so a lot of times they'll have compassion mainly just against parents. And then you see them among their peers, and they can be kind of nasty little people. And so part of what we want to do on the inside within these boundaries is show them what compassion looks like. When people disagree with you, when people don't think the same as you, when people don't have the same things as you, it is not to be mocked. You should have compassion for not people that are different from us, but have compassion for humankind, because we're all different. And what you learn, at 53, it's quite evident to me, is that all of us are in this struggle. Like if I was teaching you about teenagers 20 years ago, I'd have had all the answers. But now what I know is, man, it's just hard. It was hard for me raising teenagers. I had an education, I had experience. It's hard being a teenager. It's hard raising teenagers. And so part of my compassion that I've grown into is, wow, it's just hard being a human. And it's really hard raising other humans. And what kids don't know yet is that there is not some pat answer just because you've got new knowledge, right? Your kids are really hard to deal with sometimes because they're like, I know this. You know what you know, but you don't know what I know. And that seems so arrogant of a parent. And it's hard to kind of convey that to your kids. The fun part is when they begin to realize it and they come back to you. I used to go and apologize to my dad about once a month. And I said, Dad, I'm so sorry. And he'd say, for what? And I'm like, just for being 15. He goes, what'd you do when you were 15? I said, I was just 15. I was just horrible and I'm sorry. And he knew that I didn't know then. But I also want him to know, all that work that you did, hopefully it's paid off. So when we talk about not moving lines, we talk about being the boundary, and the boundary being the area within which we can work, and then defining the limits so kids know what that area truly is. And then working to the inside, like what are all the good things going on within this boundary, and what do we want you to know before you go to that next level on the boundary? What do we want you to know before we expand the boundaries here? This is kind of what you want to know. And so that's why we teach to the inside, right? We don't just teach, here's why no, here's why no, here's why no. Teach why the yeses. Here's why we do this. Here's why we think this way. Here's why we do this way. And so don't move those lines because it's easier on your kid or it's easier on you. But that doesn't mean there's not a time to expand the boundaries, because as your kids grow, they need more responsibility. As they show compassion, they can have more reasons to exercise that. They can have more situations where they can handle it and not be, again, kind of a jerk. It's like, you know what, you're not very nice to people when we do this, and so I'm not going to put you in these situations. We've had times where we've sent children home from our house because our child was not acting appropriately. It's like, you know what, you're not a very good friend right now. You're not being respectful to your parents. And so we're not going to have them, not just as a punishment, but also it's like, you need to learn how to act with your family regardless. And then you also need to know how to act around your friends, particularly when you're in my house. I don't want you acting around your friends that way when you're not with me, when you're not in my house. And so here's one of the ways I can set those boundaries. So you don't move the lines just for convenience sake, because you're tired, because the kid's pitching a fit, because the kid wants to push those boundaries and you just don't want to fight it anymore. You've got to stand your ground. You've got to say, these are the boundaries we set. You got to know why you set them. And once you know your why, then you have that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But don't move the lines for that reason. Be the boundary and stand firm on that. Again, when you're ready to expand, you can be the one that expands that, but that's doing it because everybody's ready. That's doing it because the kid has grown. That's doing it because the kid can now handle a larger area of responsibility and compassion and values and respect and all those things. And so, when you think about that, make sure that you understand how important your role as a father is in really being that limiting force. But also, just like when we talk about defining the limits, we don't want everything to be no. One of the challenges we have is that's what we spend so much of our time doing with teenagers, that we don't talk about a lot of the yeses. And part of our job as a dad internally is to cast a vision for our children and to cast a vision for our family. Like, what do I want my family to look like in the future? And what do I want our family to be like as our kids grow up? So that informs your decisions when they're 2, when they're 10, when they're 12, when they're 22, because you have a vision for what you want this child to become and what you want your family to become. And your kids need to know that part of the reason you're setting boundaries, and part of the reason there are boundaries there and limits, is because you have a plan in mind for them. And even though they don't agree with your plan, it gives you a framework to help them. And they're not going to understand at 13, but they will understand when they're 18, 19, and 20, we hope, right? It may be 25 before they understand it, but because you did the work when they were 12, they can reflect on that and see that. If you don't set that vision, then they never will understand why you were doing what you did as a parent. They will think it's arbitrary. And as the law says, arbitrary and capricious, right? That you were just making things up as you went. And sometimes as a parent we are, but if you can be the visionary and say, this is what I want for you. I want you to be able to get an education. And even if you won't specify exactly what the education is, you specify the education for what you want them to have. Not that they'll be a doctor, not that they'll be a lawyer, not that they'll be this or that, but that the opportunity, education brings about opportunity. And so the vision you have for them is to have every opportunity that you want them to have. Well, if they don't want to be a doctor, that's fine. If they don't want to be a doctor, don't be a doctor. But the more education you get, the more opportunities you have. And when we can talk that way about kids, not only does it help us understand what our direction may be and keep our own sanity, but it helps kids know that we're doing this not as some, vision I had for myself that I did or didn't do, but the vision that I have for you is I want you to have the best. I want you to have the most opportunities. I want you to have everything that you could possibly have. So you see Argon here, and I'm going to talk about being a visionary for a minute. So my youngest son was in high school. His big brother had already been through high school, and he observed all 4 years of that. So some of the things he didn't do, he didn't fight with us as parents as much because he knew it was pretty futile. That doesn't mean that he agreed with us all the time. He just like, you know what, it's not worth the argument because you don't win those arguments. My brother never did, so why would I fight it? But one of the things we were doing one day, he was working on chemistry and he was having to memorize parts of the periodic table. And so I was helping him work through all the elements on the periodic table. And I have a science background. I have a minor in biology and minor in chemistry. My dad was a biology teacher for 17 years. And so I'm helping him work through all these things. And we got to argon. And as I was quizzing him, I said, what is the atomic number for argon? And he kind of went, and he finally answered 18, or I told him 18. I don't even remember how that worked. And I said, here's one way you can remember that. I said, remember that when you turn 18, you are gone. And he's like, what? I said, you know, when you turn 18 and you become an adult, you don't get to live here anymore. Now, you can live here between college semesters. You can always come visit. But the idea is when you are 18, you are gone. And I will tell you that I don't know if he knows any other part of the periodic table, but he knows 18 is argon, right? And that's part of that vision, not to say I'm just going to kick you out, but that some of the work I'm doing now is to prepare you to leave this house. Because honestly, number one, I want that to be one of your goals. I want your goal to be an independent, successful person on your own terms. And to do that, you don't get to stay around here under the protection and coddling of your mother and father. Really, the coddling of your mother. Father didn't coddle him a whole lot. But part of the vision I gave them was they never didn't think they were going to college, because that was part of our discussion all the time. It was an expectation that we set. Now, as our kids got older, we began to talk about options outside of college, because we knew that we needed them to understand you have options and you could do different things, but you're going to do something. And so college was always in the mix, but it wasn't like, you know, had to be our final decision. We gave them as many options as possible. But the main option they got was, when you turn 18, you got to find a way to make a living. Now, if you're going to go get an education in order to make a living, we'll support you in that. If you don't want to get an education, then at 18, you better figure things out, because I'm not here to support you through doing things that I don't support. And so, like I said, he figured out very, very quickly that, you know, Dad's not going to let me stay around here. He actually got out of college, got a job, had that job for about 3 or 4 months, and that company closed. And he actually moved back for about 2 months. But he moved back as an adult, and he moved back while he got a couple of paychecks under him to go get his own apartment. And even though he lived very close to us for that time frame, he had his own place. Because why? Because I said, when you're 18, you are gone. Also, because he was an adult and Dad still had rules at home, he's like, yeah, I'm gone. And I'm like, that's what we were raising you to do. And so let's talk about what that vision looks like. There's 3 ways I want you to look at this and how we define that vision. First, who over why. What you want to do with your kids is you want to develop them into a person, into the type of human that you think they should be. Now, they may choose to be a different type of human, but when you're setting that vision, the main ingredient is who. Because if you're a doctor, if you're the president or prime minister, if you're an international rock star, if you're a custodian, a janitor, a truck driver, a farmer, a day laborer, whatever, if you're picking fruit, I don't care what you do, but I do care who you are. And one of the things my father taught me, that I taught my kids, and my father taught my kids, when they would go away on a trip, you know, maybe a 2 or 3 day trip with church or school, we would always say, remember who you are. You're a Hall, you're Jake Hall, you're Josh Hall. That means something. You're going to want to protect your name. So remember who you are. Remember whose you are because of our faith in God. And remember who you represent. Meaning you've got a family that has their name attached to you. You have a community that has their name attached to you. And so who you are matters. And so I'm not as concerned about what they're doing for a living, where they're living, what their finances are. What I'm worried about is who is the person they're becoming. And that's got to be the main driver of your vision over why. But why is very important as well, because why would I want you to be that type of human? And I talked about faith. Faith drives my idea of who I want you to be. So why is important, but it drives the who, right? And so, but why would I be that? Well, because you do have a name. because you do come from a legacy of people that tried to be good human beings, because you came from a legacy of people that did hard work so you can be where you are now. Right? And that's where we get upset, because our kids don't appreciate us like we think we ought to be appreciated. Believe me, over time they will. But they're not going to do it when they're 15. So be patient and just keep doing this kind of work. So who is important? Why is what, who drives why? Why drives what? What am I going to do? What am I going to do with my life? What am I going to do with my time? What am I going to do with my actions and reactions? Well, that's driven by the why. Right? And then what am I going to do is more important than the how. What we want to do with teenagers so many times is say, do it this way, do it this way, do it this way. We're focused on the how, and we're not about the what or the why or the who. And to set your vision, you go in the opposite direction. This is who I hope you become. This is the type of person, type of human I want you to become. Here's why I want you to become that person. Here's what you would do to become that type of person because of the why. Like, I want you to go get an education because I believe it will make you a well-rounded person and give you the opportunities I want you to have. And I know that if you have more opportunities, it will allow you, honestly, to be a better who. Not because you're smarter, not because you have more education, but because you have more opportunities. You're less in survival mode and more in thrive mode. And that may be financially thriving, but more so, I want you to thrive as a human being in the environments in which you live and react. And then the other thing is, we'll get down to the how. I don't think that we don't spend time on the how with teenagers. Sometimes we say, this is how you take the trash out. This is how you clean your room. This is how you do that. But when you get under that stress, when things get really tough, you've got to get back to the why. Now, just like you don't reason with a 2-year-old, sometimes you don't reason with a teenager. But in your discussions, and particularly when things are calmer, particularly when they'll ask questions, or after the storm and you're kind of cleaning up after the tornado, you can have these discussions of, here's why I want you to do this. I want you to go to college because of these things, or I want you to get an education because of these things. So they need to hear the why, because it will help them on those good days. It will help you survive on the bad days, because you've got to remember your why as well. But it will help you stick to your guns, do the things that you need to do, and do that. And so as a parent, understand that vision drives your parenting. And it's hard for our vision to drive our parenting when we've got teenagers about to drive us nuts, right? And so we've got to remember that vision. We've got to remember, what do we want to end up with? Because when we parent, we're really parenting for the long run. We're not parenting to have the best 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old. When they're 2, when they're 10, when they're 12, when they're 20, we're parenting for them to become the best adult possible. So when you set boundaries and define limits, and kids are wanting to push against that, you can do one of two things. You can react and explode, which is a very natural reaction, or you can fold and say, never mind, I don't have the strength and energy to do this. Well, just like when you're trying to survive out in the desert, in the mountains, wherever you may be trying to survive, you want to give up, but if you give up, all is lost. And so remember that as we go through this time for teenagers, you're parenting for the long run. The reason I'm so adamant about what we do with early childhood is because I know that what we do at 3, 4, and 5 has a huge impact on what kind of teenagers they are. It doesn't mean they're going to be perfect. It doesn't mean they're not going to be defiant. It doesn't mean they're not going to push limits. But because you've built a relationship with your kids in the early years, you're going to be able to survive the storms of the later years. The other thing is, if you keep your vision, keep your limits, keep your boundaries, and you stand firm in that, as tiring as that is, then when you get through those storms, your kids will know how hard you worked to get them where they were, that they're going to see an appreciation about the work that you did, but more so, they're actually going to end up where you hope they end up. Now, the challenge is kids can make any decision they want. But the reason you want to parent for the long run too is so that you know you've done everything that you're supposed to do. You've done everything in your power to be the best parent you can be. And so as we talk about that, I wanted this to be an encouragement. I know we talked about cyber addictions. We talked about all that. But what we've got to have is this framework, because without this framework, none of that begins to make sense. And so as we go into questions here in a minute, I want you to think about, how does that apply to the question that I have? And most of it will inform the answers that we get given here. By the way, we're still doing a dad's coaching session every Wednesday. We've had 2. We've got room for more guys. If you're interested, sign up at strongfathers.com AMA, which is Ask Mike Anything. We're getting input from dads. They're giving us great insight. We're also using that to provide more information to you guys. Part of what we talked about today was informed from our coaching session. So if you'd like to join us, it's free. It's every Wednesday night about this time, 9 o'clock. We'd love to have you. Just sign up at strongfathers.com AMA. There's no cost or obligation. We'd love to have you, and we'd love to have a commitment from you, but there's no homework and no grades. And so we do that. Also, before we get out of here, if you have any questions, you can email me. And also, we'd love to have you guys join us. Number one, sign up for the FES at all social media, but also at Strong Fathers, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd love to have interactions with you then, particularly at the end of this series. Now that we're ending the series, we want to stay in contact. You may help inform the next set of the next series based on our dialogue, if you will, on social media. And so, Thomas, I'll give it back to you. I have talked plenty, but I'll be ready to answer questions.
Well, thank you, Mike. So before we get to the questions, okay, it's that time of the night. I'm going to pop the FES donation details up on the screen again. As always, it's always. A big thank you to all who donated to FES these past weeks, and thank you very much, especially for, really taking the trouble to really partner us with this, in trying to get families great help. Your contributions, will help us organize more talks, bring in more experts like Mike, and plan more programs to strengthen marriage and family. So please continue to support FES in whatever way you can. Help us spread the word, tell your friends about these talks, or share the links to the recordings once you receive them, so you can watch the whole season. And if you haven't already, please, do consider donating to the cause, because every little bit does count. Now, I want to get back to the questions, because I think, let me just take a look at that. There we go. All right, so coming back to the questions now, James has a question. I mean, James would ask, what do you say to teens who always insist on learning through natural consequences, and obviously some of which are very long-lasting effects, and how do you teach them to be empathetic, to put themselves in someone else's shoes instead of being locked into this self-absorbed world of their own?
I think that's why we wanted to talk about kind of teaching to the inside, because as they're always pushing up against limits, we're always just kind of on the other side of the fence going, no, 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 no. And part of our job, and it's a lot of hard work, particularly for kids that just keep wanting to push the fence, is to gain their attention and say, look, I want to show you what's over here. And that takes some patience, but it also takes some reflection for that teenager. There are some kids that they're the pig that's squealing before they hit the fence. They know the consequences, and they're going to run right through them anyways. And those kids are really hard, because a lot of times we'll have one kid that we looked at them wrong, and they just quit doing whatever. And the other kid's like, you can look at me, you can beat me, you can take everything away, I'm going to do what I want to do. And those kids are really difficult. One of the things we have to do is not only give these kids grace, but the hard part about being a parent is you still set the boundaries, you still set it, but understand that sometimes that kid is the one that's going to learn from natural consequences. And it's hard. Like, I've had to talk to people that have very defiant teenagers. And, part of this is from my faith, and part of this is from life experience of, we don't want our kids to go through any hard times. We don't want our kids to be addicted. We don't want our kids to pick the wrong friends. We don't want our kids to be in a bad relationship or have, bad sexual experiences or anything like that. And yet you do all you can to set those boundaries and give that loving care. And we have to understand that sometimes kids are going to do that. That's not an excuse to quit doing the work, but it's also, you know, part of the reason I tell parents that is this is parenting for the long run. And just like they learned, you know, when they were 3, when the consequences were much less, of course, we watched them learn. And even though they were defiant, maybe at that age, that they learned and they came back around because they're like, that wasn't worth it. A lot of times your most defiant teenagers are the best young adults to be around, because they're like, man, you know, and even my oldest son was a fine young man, but he was a typical teenager. And so my comeuppance for him is he's now a high school teacher. And so he will come back and go, man, I was a real jerk in high school. I'm like, yeah, you kind of were, but that's part of that learning. And what we want to do so many times is, why won't you stay in the fence? And we do one of two things. We just stand on the other side of the fence and yell and bark and beat. Or we just say, you know what, never mind, take down the fence. And I say you set those boundaries, and then you continue to work from the inside. Like, look, this is why we want you to do this. And again, I don't think you reason every minute of the day, but there are some kids that they're pushing the limits because they want to know why. And they're pushing the limits because they feel like they're not getting what they need. And that takes a lot of discussion. And it takes a lot of humility as a parent to realize that what you're providing this child for them personally is not enough. Now, that doesn't mean you have to have guilt about that sometimes, but sometimes we have to come in and say, you know, ask them why. And then when they tell us why, not react to whatever, you know, dumb or smart thing they say, because they're coming from their perspective. When I was a principal, I would have parents come in and say, my kid said this, and this happened. I said, it didn't happen that way. And they would say, are you saying my kid would lie? And I'm like, well, yes, your kid would lie. That's what teenagers do sometimes. But more so, the reason they didn't see the truth was they saw the truth through those eyes, through the eyes of a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old. And part of what we've got to do, what drives us nuts, is we want them to see it as the truth that we know is. And you'll get down the road and realize that even your truth was not the whole truth, right? Upon reflection, it hardly ever is. But we know that the kids don't have the whole set of truth. The problem is they're not going to have eyes to see that. They're either myopic because they're that kind of kid, or they're myopic because that's the experience. When you don't have a broad experience, that's all you know. And so you're going to go with what you know, and that's what they fight for. That's what they fight against. And I think two things: number one, being patient; number two, being humble, but also allowing those consequences. One of the biggest challenges that I think we have in the world, but particularly here in the US, is that people have taken out those consequences because they don't want their kids to suffer natural consequences. Well, when they don't suffer the natural consequences, they don't learn anything. And then when they finally do get out from underneath your roof and they get into the world, they're some of the horrible people we're seeing on TV right now. Right? We've got people that are out there protesting, real good reasons to protest and doing things appropriately. And then we've got this set of people that are just out to cause chaos because they've never had a consequence to their action. And so everything they did was okay. And what we've got to do, and this is a great time about teenagers, is there are some bad things we don't want them to go through. But if we protect them from every natural consequence, then they're never going to learn. You can set the boundary and say, you don't want to learn this lesson yet. And when they say, well, yes, I do. All right, then, here you go. And when they learn that, you want to do that within that controlled environment. You know, there was a time when I could tell my child, you can drive here, but you can't drive to these other places. And they thought they wanted to drive to and I said, you don't. And sometimes they would and not tell me. Sometimes they would and get lost and have to tell me they were there and deal with the consequences at home. But then there was a time when they left my house, I had no say about where they went, but I had given them every opportunity to learn within that controlled environment. So let your kids make mistakes. Let your kids get some natural consequences. And that's hard because we don't want them to hurt. We don't want them to go down the wrong path. We also feel like every wrong decision will be the worst wrong decision ever. And I don't think that's the case. Kids will grow, kids will come around, but sometimes they have to learn the hard lessons to come back around. And that's hard on us as parents.
Mike, apathy and complacency seem to be the two key words that affect a lot of teenagers, obviously. So, you know, parents want to help them find their passion, help them find the way. But most times, automatically, they reject most of what we say. So they just want to be left alone with their games. What can we do?
Well, yeah, we could do session on games. And one of the reasons they love games is because not only are they immersed in it, but those games are built to do exactly what their brain's looking for. Like, I don't play a lot of games on my phone, and there are certain games that have become quite addictive for people. And one of the main reasons they're not addictive to me is not only because I am a little lazy, but the other part is I have the sound turned down. And what I realize is when the sound's up and every time you do something well in the game, it gives you a mental thing, like it gives you a mental reward. Our kids are going into that and getting all these rewards. What they're not getting from us is mental reward. And guess what? Parents can't keep up with those kind of rewards. And so it's another reason not only do you limit their access to those things, but it's where you try to spend time and not just the no. Right? When we talk about getting an education, they don't always understand the why because we haven't talked to them about who. And kids, even some of the most apathetic kids, when you sit down and talk to them, they have real dreams about who they want to be. But if we're the ones defining who they want to be all the time, if we're not having that negotiation and discussion, then the reason they tune us out is because we're not, in their mind, on the same page. You may know better. Just like when your 3-year-old said, I want to be a race car driver. I want to be a fireman. I want to be a superhero. And we're like, well, being a superhero is a little hard to come by. We gave them that chance to grow. When our kid says, I want to be a rock star, okay, if that's who you want to be, that's what you're doing, but who do you want to be? Like, what kind of person would you be if you were a rock star? Well, I would give money. I would have a platform. I would be, okay, whatever. Or I'd have 18 cars. You never know what motivates your kid. But who do you want to be? Because that's going to get to the heart of a kid. But when we're always talking about no, or we're always saying not just be within the parameters, but be right here, that's when we begin to get pushback. That's when many of us kind of go back to our PTSD about being a teenager, was nobody was listening to me and everybody told me exactly what to do. I've got a brain, I've got some autonomy, and yes, I'm pushing against the fence. Well, if you can turn that kid around and go, but let's talk about what's available in here. If I'll quit saying no and find some yeses, then they'll do the same thing. And the reason I'm not giving you anything specific, because a kid's apathetic about different things at different times. You have to understand, as tiring as it is to have a teenager, it's just as tiring to be a teenager. And we don't think so. We don't think so because you've got all this stuff given to you. You've got all these things, but you're a capable human being. You're a strong physical human being now because you've grown into it. So why can't you do all these things? They're still a kid at heart. They're still trying to figure out how to grow. It is tiring and fatiguing to do all that growing physically. Those of you that have teenage boys and girls that are just eating you out of what we would say out of house and home, that is tiring just to physically grow. It is tiring to figure out what part of the kid do I want to keep and what kind of an adult do I want to become. And when I want to be a kid, nobody lets me be a kid. When I want to be an adult, nobody lets me be an adult the way I want to be an adult. And so there's always this huge fluctuation, and it's just exhausting for kids, which makes it exhausting for parents. So I think part of what we can do in that apathy is give them, not open up the boundaries as much as give them the inside of that. That's why I went back to that framework, because we spend so much time as parents on no. And we were talking about this in our coaching session. When you have a kid that, like particularly one that's learning disabled or has some developmental issues, it's hard for them to make, multiple choices. So you say, do you want this one or this one? Because then no, I'm going to give you 2 choices. And I think we have to do the same thing with our teenagers of, do you want this or this? Well, I want to push to the fence. No. We're not going to the fence. Here's what we have available to you now. And I'm going to give you 2, maybe 3 choices, but you're going to pick something from inside these boundaries. Well, I don't want to. Okay, well, when you're ready, come see me. Because what you know as a parent, what you're doing is giving them choices, which lends them, gives them some autonomy as becoming an adult. And at the same time, there's some of that built in where as a kid, they get to make some choices that are fun for them. And that's always the case. But we always get so cut and dried, and I think we take it very personally. I think somebody put that on there about how our ego comes into our teenagers. Understand that everybody knows how hard it is to have a teenager. Most of us know how hard it is to be a teenager. So if your teenager is not the most upstanding citizen, and I don't mean a delinquent, but I mean is just not the most polite child and those things, even though you address it, don't let it get to you as an ego. It's not a reflection on who you are. It's a reflection of who your kid is, where they're at right now. And most of us get that. Those that don't get it will get it when they have a teenager, right? And so you've all had people when you had your child who was going to tell you how you should parent and they've never had a kid. The same thing goes when people see you as your teenagers, right? Like my teen never did that. I'm like, maybe you never saw your teenager do that, but I bet they did that. So I think when we talk about apathy, like you said, how do they find their passion? Well, you've got to give them room to have their passion. If their passion is becoming a rap star, well, then give them some room to do that. No, you're not going to let them run off. No, you're not going to buy them a recording studio. But as soon as they say a rap star and we start going, rap stars do this and that, and no, and none of my child are going to, you've limited everything. And now they just feel like they're just a fence on both sides. Give them room to explore and they become less apathetic. Give them room to do these things. My kids would come to me and when I was having a good day and say, I want to do that. I'm like, well, I bet you would be good at that. And inside, I'm about to go, there's no way my kid's going to do that as an adult. But what I knew was over time, because they're under my influence, they're going to find that that's not something. And then when we got down to being pretty serious about it, I was like, let's talk about that. Let's talk about who you want to be. Is that going to allow you to be who you want to be? Is that going to allow you to do what you want to do? Is that going to give you your why? Is that going to be something that drives you? You know, are you going to be able to sustain that kind of lifestyle because your why doesn't push you that direction, right? So all those things come into play. But I think more so is understanding that inside, we're always worried about setting limits. Always go back and focus on what's available to your child and get them to focus on what's available to them. And maybe you expand that, not because you're trying to limit them from getting into trouble, but you're expanding that because they need that expansion. If they need to be a rap star for a little bit or they need to work on it, let them write poetry. Let them do that because it's not defining them forever. What a 14-year-old decides they're going to do is not who they're going to be for the rest of their life. And I think that's really hard, particularly for our first kids. When we have our first teenager, we're pretty sure that whatever they said at 14 is, going to direct their life forever. And how are they ever going to make it? And we've got to know that's that parenting for the long run piece.
Okay, so for dads who are religious or who have great emphasis on their spirituality, it's sometimes hard to know when to stop preaching, when to just listen, or just be a good witness, because you just kind of jump to the Bible and things like that. But embodying that love is quite another thing. Do you have anything to share with dads who are going through that?
Yeah, and that's even a challenge for me right now because as my kids are 24 and 28, they have not embraced their faith in a way that I want them to. I don't think they're without faith, but like kids that age, and I say kids, adults that age, are embracing their faith in a much different way than I did as in an Orthodox way, through the 70s and 80s. But what I have to know, where I have to stay calm within myself is, number one, I am sorry for whatever I didn't provide, right? There is that grief of looking back going, man, I should have done this more. I should have done that more. I don't know that you know that one way or the other, but what I know is it goes back to that who. What I have tried to show them and what gets reflected back to me on the good times is that I showed them who I was. I showed them how I treat people. They saw me go to church out of responsibility at times. And I'm okay with that because sometimes that's how you sustain your faith is sometimes you just get up and yeah, there are times when you go through the actions. But what I hope they saw in me was the fact that faith drove me to do the things that I do, right? And part of my job is easier because I work with dads and it has this kind of, it has a different aura about it. I don't think it should, but it does to people and even to my kids, right? And I've even had to tell them that if I quit doing this, It doesn't change who I am. I can't let even this work that I'm doing now define me, because it can fall apart. It can go away. It can be the way I'm not making a living. Who I am drives me to do this work, but this work does not tell me who I am. And it's the same thing with our faith. Of who I am drives my faith experience, and my faith experience helps inform me of who I need to be. But preaching, I don't think worked for any of us. You used a great word of witnessing and being. And like my wife was a preacher's kid, and she had the typical dilemma of having a man in her house that stood up and said certain things from the pulpit, and then she didn't see him living them at home. Whereas my example was, I had a dad that didn't have a pulpit, but I saw him living those things out regardless of whether he was in public or not. You know, and so she has a very different feel and a different relationship with her dad, because she saw the disconnect. What I was able to see in my dad was what he said about things, even though he struggled like all of us do. What he said about things, I saw him put into action in his day-to-day life. Right? There are days, most days now, that I get up early and I read something spiritual, I read something about business, I read something instructional to inform my work, but I'm doing that early morning, almost every morning, and I never thought I would do that. And one of the reasons I do that is because now, not only do I enjoy it, but I've come to enjoy it because I remember my dad doing it. And he never told me, you ought to get up early and read books. But I saw him every morning, and more so when he was older, and, you know, let me know that I wasn't a horrible person at 30 for not doing this while I was trying to raise kids. But now that I have the opportunity, I should take advantage of it. And the reason I know that is not because of what he said and not because of what he preached, but because of what I watched him do. The fact that I get up and go to work, and then I go outside and work on the farm when it's hot and horrible and it's just not a lot of fun. The reason I do that is because I know my dad did it, and I know it makes a difference, and I saw him do that. And not just my dad, but other mentors. So if you want to pass on your faith to your kids, it's not through preaching. It can be through habit. I do think that within the boundaries, if in your home, if you go to church, your kids go to church with you. They get to make the decision not to go to church when they leave. But that's another reason we talked about the things we talked about today. The what is not the important part before you have the why and the who. Who do you want to be? Why do you want to be that person? Well, this is what you do to be that person. If you want to be a compassionate, godly person, then you want to be in a community of faith. You want to read the scriptures or the wisdom literature that's in your faith, and you want to follow that through, because that's going to help you be who you want to be. But the what never does any good. And I think that's what we struggle with our teenagers, is we're always talking about the what. Do this, do this, do this. Why? Because I said so. That's not helped anybody. Now, I don't think you have to yell the why all the time either, but they need to see the why in your life. That being said, they also need to see the struggles of your faith as well. So many times we don't want to let our kids know what our struggles are. And so it's really hard for them as they get out and have their own struggles to think, they think something's wrong with them because I never saw my parents have these struggles. Well, we got to share that with them. So we got to share our struggles in our faith on top of all those good days in our faith, or when we're down with our why and why we're living that and expressing that, they need to get that why as well, right? It's not just I go to church because people expect me to. I go to church because that's where I find community and encouragement, right? That's where I find my learning. That's where I get encouraged, all those things. Even though some days you're like, let's go, let's get up. We're going to church. Why? That's what we do. Because there's going to be days in their life where they know you just get up and do what you're supposed to do. And then those things will drive, those things will come around. It's just what you have to do some days.
Okay, we're going to take two more questions. And this one I really like, so I'm just going to read this verbatim. So how would you manage a teen who behaves like the pigs who keep running towards the fence and seem intent on becoming bacon?
That's the hard part, is we don't want our kids to end up bacon, right? So we were talking about faith, and I will give you one of the examples I use because this is our biggest concern. I set these fences up because I don't want my child getting out, right? I don't want my child getting into the world that they're not ready to handle. You know, if my pigs got out, they ran away, and I couldn't feed them, and here in Texas, they wouldn't last very long because something wants to eat them or something wants to run over them, right? We have both of those things going on. So I set those parameters to protect them, and some of those pigs just didn't want to be protected. Now, what we would do is if they did that enough, we just shipped them to the butcher. You can't do that with your kid. So what do, you know, with your kid when you're like, okay, so what am I going to do? The Bible says, raise up a child in the way that they shall go, and when they are old, they will not depart from it. It goes back to our former discussion. The problem is we think 18 is old. Well, or 24 is old, or 32 is old. And those kids are going to come back to what they know, but we don't know what they're going to have to go through. I think of the prodigal, the story of the prodigal, but I think of the biblical story of Samson. And when Samson was born, his birth was prophesied, right? Like, Samson is coming and he's going to save the Israelites. And an angel came and told his mom and dad, told his mom, who then told his dad, this is the kind of kid, this is who he's going to be. And even the dad, I use this in my fathering work, you know, on the faith side of the dad said, what are the rules for this kid? It's exactly what we're asking here. So what am I supposed to do? Because I want this kid to become this, what you're telling me he's going to become. So what should I do? Don't cut his hair. He's not to eat grapes. All these things, all these rules. Think about being Samson's parents down the road. So you're in the grocery store, you're at a party, you're at a gathering of some sort, and somebody comes up and says, how's Samson? What's Samson been up to lately? Well, let's see. Samson married a girl that he probably shouldn't have married, or he tried to, and then he got in a fight at the bachelor party. And because he lost a bet at the bachelor party, he went and killed 1,000 people. And then he did that, you know, and then he met another girl and she wasn't any good for him. Now he's in prison with his eyes gouged out. And you're like, this was the kid they prophesied about. What we know is in that story, even after all that hard time, he became a hero. And what I have to remember for myself and my kids, what I have to remember for those of you that have kids that are defiant is, number one, this is from my faith, give them to God, right? Like I said, you can't ship them off, but sometimes you got to hand them over and you're like, God, this is more than I can handle, but God can handle it. The other piece to that is to know that these kids may become the person they're supposed to be from the challenges that they're going through. Like I had some great teachers that taught for me in middle school and high school because they were the worst kid ever. But they were the best teacher to impact the lives of those kids that were struggling that way. Whereas those of us that were kind of this straight-laced, you know, I don't say I was all-American boy, but I was, you know, very religious and I was scared to get in trouble. And I had trouble really teaching high school kids because I had such high expectations for them because I didn't have the same struggles. You know, I tended to have more of those struggles when I got into college. And so I think you keep putting the fence up, you keep putting them back in the fence, and you keep telling them, look, it's so much better inside the fence. That's where you go back and you instruct to the inside. It's like, here's what I'm providing for you. And that may be a discussion where you can say, okay, so if I move the fence out 2 more feet, 3 more feet, 5 more feet, would that keep you from going out? And I'm not talking about negotiating things that are not good for kids, but we don't always realize why they're pushing the limit. And that discussion could be very informative. Sometimes it can be informative that they just want to do what they want to do. But what happens is we make the assumption that a kid that keeps running through the fence is just going to do whatever they want to do. And they're being defiant. And all they really want to do is get 2 feet over the fence. They just want whatever, like I had pigs like that they just wanted the grass that wasn't inside the fence. There's this great weed out here that I want to eat and I'm going to go get. They didn't go running off. They stayed right there because they liked being close to the herd, but they just needed that 2 other feet. And if we can have that discussion with our kids is, so why are you doing this? Why are you, getting out of the house in the middle of the night when I've told you not to do that? Well, I just want to be with my friends. Yeah, but I don't think that's a good thing. Yeah, but you don't like my friends. Well, here's why I don't like your friends. Or maybe I don't understand your friends. Or what if your friends came here? And that's hard as a parent because you're like, I don't like your friends. I don't like what they're doing. And there may be a reason to absolutely keep that child away from them. But if you expand that boundary just a few more feet and then talk about what's inside that boundary, can we live within that for right now? Knowing that there's going to be a day where your fence gets bigger, that the boundaries get bigger. But sometimes we've been so restrictive that we don't realize that what their heart wants, what their heart needs is just a few feet out, and so maybe we can expand that without giving in, without negotiating to bad things, but you've got to have those discussions. They go directly to you never let me do anything, and we go directly to you never do what I tell you. And usually, even for the toughest kid, there's something in the middle for that. It's a lot of discussion, though.
Okay, we're going to take one last question. Now, obviously, consequences can very easily become ineffective if the teenager refuses to follow the consequences or accept them, and that chain breaks down. So how do we navigate that?
I think, again, give them as much boundary as you think is appropriate. And then as they push it, there is a time to tighten that up. So we actually had when we built our house, it was before games were just coming in to play, right? The gaming systems and stuff. It's 2001. And so we were just getting these, and I knew my kids were going to have all kind of electronics, computers and things. So each one of their rooms was actually put on one breaker. I think I've told this story already, but we built it that way that if there was ever a time that they wouldn't do what we asked them to do, they're like, I'm going to my room. Well, that's fine. Click. You have no electricity in your room, right? Like it was down to scorched earth policy for that. And I think what we want to do is, like you said, as they push past the consequences, I think you have to get down to part of it is if you've had these discussions, if you've given them all the inside stuff they can handle or should want, and they're still just going to be defiant and they just don't care about what the consequences are, you really do have to be ready to do two things. Number one, not take this personally. Not say you're being mean and disrespectful to me. That may be how it feels, but that can't be part of what informs how you're going to set this up. The other thing is you need to go to the nth limit. And that can be down to everything is out of the room, down to we will bring you your clothes each day to wear because you're not choosing the right, you're wearing things that are inappropriate, and that's boys or girls. We're not going to give you any space to keep things because you keep, let's say, drugs or alcohol or other things. You don't get your gaming system because when I tell you to get off your gaming system, you're done. There are times when we ground our kids and we're really grounding ourselves. And that's where parents sometimes make bad decisions is, this is too inconvenient for me, so I'm going to let them get away with it. Well, that's just going to give them more and more reason to push past. So there's a time when you do define that limit and you tighten that up. I had a young man that was using heroin as 8th grade. And his parents, we got him into rehab. And when he came back, his parents said, he's coming back to school. What are we going to do? And I didn't even have teenagers yet, but I had a building full of teenagers. And I said, he's wearing the clothes that are part of that culture. You've got to change that. A white t-shirt and a pair of jeans is fine in our school. He can wear that every day. And make him wear the same thing every day because he's not made good choices. Now, as he makes better choices, you can relax off of that. And I said, he gets a sheet, he gets a pillow without a pillowcase because you can hide stuff in a pillowcase. And he gets a mattress on the floor and you take the door off the hinges. And they couldn't believe that I asked him to take the door off the hinges because you don't get any privacy if you haven't deserved any privacy. You don't get a place to put things if you're putting bad things in there. You don't get the gaming system if you don't control yourself with the gaming system or the phone. One of the things that I thought about yesterday that we kind of talked about in our coaching was we talk about taking the phone away. And then sometimes we give in because we need a way to contact our kids. What I used to do was take the phone away. But I needed to get in contact with my kids. So I would let them have their phone, but I took texting off. And what's so funny to me about that is if you remove texting, it's like they don't know how to communicate. Like they don't understand you can push a button and talk to your friends. And so it's the most maddening thing to a teenager. If you just want to get back at your teenager, like if you're just being spiteful, take texting off of it. just to say, you don't get texting for a week. It will drive them insane. But those limits have to be, number one, within those parameters for the who and the why, and to the point of incrementally, because if you go to the nth degree, if you tighten the fence all the way up, you have no more room to work. And you want to give this child a chance to be successful, instead of going to the nth degree of taking everything out of your room. So you won't listen to me and get off your games, so I'm going to take all your electronics. No, maybe they can handle the other ones, responsibly. There's a good chance they won't, but you give them each chance to be successful. If you begin to do what I tell you, when I tell you to do it, you might get your game back. Or if you get your game back, you're going to get it for an hour, and then it's coming back into my possession, because you've not earned the right to just keep playing, because you don't get off when I tell you to get off. And so doing those things incrementally, being prepared to go to the nth degree. So many times we do it out of anger, we do it out of fear, we do it out of taking it personally, that we just take everything, or we just lock everything down. You cannot talk to your friends. You can't be around your friend. Well, what would be wrong with a friend coming to the house while they're under your roof and your control, right? Again, the door's open, or they don't even go into the room. They're at your house. You have to tolerate whatever the talk is, whatever it is, but you're giving them that opportunity. And then as they become more responsible, maybe they can go see their friend. Maybe their friend can get in the room and play games or be on the phone or whatever they do. But you've got to give it a chance, give your child a chance to be successful with the punishment and or the parameters that you've set.
Thank you, Mike. As always, it's been really enriching just to listen to you. Now, since we're on the topic of teenagers, I want to just quickly highlight a wonderful course for parents. Okay, it's a wonderful course for parents of adolescent children, age 14 to 18. It's run by the IFFD, or the International Federation for Family Development. It's a program designed to equip you with the communications tools and knowledge you need to more effectively parent teenagers. And you can read more about this or find out more information on the FES website at fes.org.sg. Now, before we end, I just really want to thank Mike for his loving generosity. I mean, his great kindness in working with FES to pull this amazing first season together. It's really no exaggeration to say that we couldn't have done this without the dedication and generous support of Mike. It's been a wonderful, as I said, it's been a deeply enriching and very educational past 10 weeks or so that we've been learning what it means to be stronger, better dads. And even then, we're barely just touching the tip of the iceberg, the topics we've covered. So there's so much more to learn, so much more we need to do to level up as dads. So please, pray for Mike, pray for his ministry, pray for the team at FES as we work towards season 2 of Dads Matter. And if you have some feedback for us on how we can improve these sessions, please do leave your comments in the chat box. We'll take a look at them right after the session. But before we go, Mike, is there anything you'd like to say to our friends?
Well, number one, I have truly enjoyed this. It has been an honor to me to do this. This is a challenge to me, not to say, it's not a challenge to talk, but it is a challenge to organize all those words. And it's been good. It's been good learning for me. It's been wonderful to be treated so graciously, to be treated so warmly. I will tell you, on the days where now that I'm not out running around the country, getting a chance to speak, this has been affirming to me three things. Number one, that hopefully what we do here at Strong Fathers has value, and you found value in that, and that's meant the world to me. The other piece is that you just don't always think about this when you look at what the media says about the world. Tons of parents, 99% of the parents, love their children and are doing a great job and trying to do a great job raising their kids. We focus on all the bad things so many times, and you guys have been a great encouragement to me, not only with the work at FES, but the questions that folks are asking, the fact that you've been here, in the numbers that you've been here consistently. If you've been to all 5 sessions, is that how many we've done, Thomas? I think we've done 5. If you've been to all 5 sessions, just put in the chat that you've made 5. If you made 4 or 3, that's fine too. Put that number in. But we'd love to see, You know, how many of you made every session? That's a huge sacrifice, honestly. If we're on our best day, for you to give us that much time out of your life means a lot to us. And so, yeah, join us on Facebook. Number one, join FES because there's so many resources right there in Singapore. Join us on Strong Fathers on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. On Instagram, you may have to see a dog or a cow every once in a while, but we'll share that with you. But yeah, we'd love to continue the dialogue. And also we'd love to have your feedback about what can we do next? Because here's the thing. This is not about dads. This work is about what happens to your kids. And what I hope more than anything is that we can all work to be better for our kids so that our kids have every opportunity to reach their highest potential. That's why we do this work. And dads, you're a huge part of that. And hopefully you've heard that in these 5 sessions. And moms, hopefully you understand that we need your support. And we believe in the strength of moms just as much as we believe in the strengths of dads. So thank you guys so much.
And so again, we hope you've enjoyed this season of Dads Matter as much as we've enjoyed bringing it to you. And I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. So please remember to take the online poll before you leave. And also, once again, follow Mike Hall and with Mike and all those and Strong Fathers, Strong Families. And we hope to see you when we return for more Dads Matter next season. So on behalf of Mr. Mike Hall and FES, thank you everyone and have a good night.